Why are Israel and Iran always at odds? It's a question the news rarely answers. You'll hear about nuclear deals, sanctions, proxy wars, and drone strikes. But what if none of it started in a war room? What if the roots of today's tension stretch not decades back, but thousands of years? Not in politics, but in prophecy. This video exists because missiles have returned to the sky and whispers of annihilation fill the air. But long before Iran ever threatened Jerusalem, something happened in a tent. And if you can understand that moment, you'll begin to understand why the Middle East never finds peace. Because the first fracture wasn't between nations. It was between two sons. His name was Abraham, a friend of God, a man of promise, a wanderer with no home, no heir, and a heart full of stars. God had told him that through his seed all nations would be blessed, that from his loins kings would come, that his descendants would be as countless as the sand and as radiant as the sky. But years passed. No son came, and Sarah, his wife, grew old with waiting. In desperation, she offered Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to bear Abraham a child. Not because she lacked faith, but because hope had withered beneath the weight of time. And so it was that Ishmael was born. Abraham was 86, Hagar young, Ishmael his firstborn. He ran, laughed, cried, and played. And Abraham loved him. For 13 years the boy was the only echo of the promise. But then God spoke again. I will give Sarah a son, and I will establish my covenant with him. Abraham pleaded, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But heaven did not bend. The promise would. The line was drawn, the rift opened, not out of hatred but election. And then the miracle. Sarah laughed when she heard it, not out of joy but disbelief. But the laugh of doubt soon became the name of faith. Isaac. He will laugh. Born to a woman whose womb had withered, Isaac was the sound of the impossible. A covenant wrapped in flesh. The child through whom the nations would be blessed. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a feast. But not everyone laughed. Sarah saw Ishmael, now a teenager, mocking Isaac. The Hebrew word sachak can mean play, but here it stings. It's the same word used when Lot's sons-in-law thought he was joking about judgment. It carries ridicule, contempt, foreshadow. Sarah didn't just see a boy mocking another. She saw a threat to the promise. And she said to Abraham, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son with Isaac." It grieved Abraham. This was his son. But God said, "In Isaac shall your seed be called." And he comforted Abraham with a promise. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will make him a great nation." So Abraham rose early, gave Hagar bread and water, and sent them away. No army, no border dispute, just a mother and son exiled into the desert. Hagar wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. The water ran out. The boy weakened, and she laid him under a bush and walked away, saying, "Let me not see the death of the child." But heaven wasn't finished. An angel called to her, "Fear not. God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, for I will make him a great nation." And she opened her eyes and saw a well. This was the first exile, the first division. A child of Abraham removed not by malice, but by mandate. Ishmael was not cursed, he was blessed. 12 princes would come from him. He would become a great people, but he would not carry the covenant. This was not rejection, it was redirection. And that is the pain many never heal from. The ache of being loved, but not chosen. The Bible doesn't condemn Ishmael. It honors him. He buried Abraham beside Isaac. He became a father of nations. And yet his story would run parallel to Isaac's, not through it. And from that rift between two sons came two worlds. From Isaac came Israel. From Ishmael, the Arab peoples. And though not every Arab descends directly from Ishmael, the symbolic divide remains. One line carried the Messiah. The other carried nations. And over centuries, that fracture hardened into rivalry, into religion, into war. But it all began with one tent, two mothers, two sons, and one promise that divided history. So why do Israel and Iran stand at odds? Because prophecy never dies. Because what was sown in the desert still bears fruit. Before Iran had nuclear ambitions, before Jerusalem had walls, before empires and armies, there was a father named Abraham trying to raise two sons under one sky. And one son had to leave. Not because he failed, but because God had a plan that required separation. That's where it began. And it's why we must go back, if we ever want to understand what lies ahead. But exile is not the end of a story. It's often the beginning of revelation. Because when Hagar and Ishmael vanished into the desert, God did not forget them. In fact, He followed them, and in the silence of Beersheba's wilderness, He spoke words that would echo for generations. They weren't just words of survival. They were prophecy. A vision of what Ishmael would become, blessing and burden intertwined. So if you've ever looked at the Middle East and wondered, why the fire, why the fury, why the restless wind across generations, the answer may have begun in a whisper beside a well. Don't miss this next revelation, because what God said to a cast-out mother might explain the world you're watching now. Let's listen to what heaven declared over the son of the desert. And so they wandered. No compass, no nation, just a skin of water, a piece of bread, and the weight of exile. Hagar watched her son grow weak under the sun, each step quieter than the last, until he could walk no more. She placed him beneath a bush, walked a short distance, and said, "Let me not see the death of the child." She wept, but heaven heard. And that's when the angel spoke not to her first, but to the boy, to Ishmael, the one whose very name means God hears. "Do not be afraid," the voice said. "God has heard the boy crying where he lies." Then Hagar's eyes were opened, and she saw a well of water. Life where death had crouched, hope where despair had whispered. But the angel said more. He gave a vision wild and startling. "I will make him into a great nation. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will dwell in hostility toward all his brothers." Not a curse, a calling. Not a judgment, a description. Ishmael would survive, thrive, multiply. But he would not be like others, a wild donkey of a man. In Hebrew, Pere Adam, an untamed, free-roaming creature of the desert, unbridled, fiercely independent, unwilling to bow to masters or kings. And isn't that what we've seen? The tribes of the desert, Bedouins, warlords, nomads rising and falling like the dunes. Empires feared their raids, nations envied their resilience. They bowed to no one. Not Rome, not Babylon, not Byzantium. And from them, great peoples arose. Arab civilizations, dynasties, scholars and poets, warriors and kings, but also conflict. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. It was not vengeance, it was vision. A child of Abraham destined for a struggle that never seemed to end. And then came religion. Centuries passed. Prophets rose, temples fell, kingdoms turned to dust. And in the sands of Arabia, a man named Muhammad began to speak. He traced his lineage back to Ishmael and said, "The promise is ours." Islam was born not as an attack on Isaac, but as a claim, a reclamation. We too are sons of Abraham. We too have heard from heaven. And so the rivalry of two brothers became the foundation of two faiths. And the echo of that desert prophecy began to roar. But what does this mean for today? Why do regimes rage? Why do missiles fly? Why does peace always seem just out of reach? Because this is not just history. It is inheritance. You can remove kings, sign treaties, redraw borders, but you cannot erase the word spoken by God in the wilderness. Ishmael's destiny still plays on. A people strong, proud, often misunderstood, blessed by God, but burning with longing. For recognition, for inheritance, for resolution. And many don't even know why the ache runs so deep. But there's something else, something beautiful. Because God didn't just promise struggle, He promised greatness. I will make him into a great nation. And He did. From the tents of Kedar to the palaces of Baghdad, the line of Ishmael left its mark. And even now, something stirs beneath the surface. Iran, modern Persia, is not directly descended from Ishmael. But the spirit of the outcast, the wild man, the challenger, that spirit breathes. And when leaders call for Israel's erasure, when crowds chant hatred, you are not hearing merely politics. You are hearing a war between promises. A conflict not born yesterday, but beside a bush in Beersheba. Yet here's the mystery. God never hated Ishmael. In fact, He named him. Before he was born, God chose his name. God hears. He sent water to save him. He sent a promise to uphold him. And He watched over him all his days. This is not a tale of rejection, it's a tale of tension. 2 lines, 2 destinies, 1 story. And the angel's words to Hagar remain one of the most overlooked prophecies in Scripture. Because they explain so much of what we see today. The pain, the pride, the persistence of a people long misunderstood. So how should we respond? With fear, with disdain, with mockery? No, with understanding, with intercession. Because God hears Ishmael still. And the line that wandered in exile might one day return not to Isaac's tent but to God's table. And perhaps the wild man of the desert still has a place in the banquet of redemption. If this truth stirred you, if something in your soul whispered, I've never seen it this way before, hold on. Because the story is only beginning. Before Ishmael became a nation, before Isaac bore Jacob, before Israel ever faced a single sword, there was another promise. One made to a barren woman, one that would birth a people, and a war of twins. And what came next would shake the very foundation of destiny. But prophecy never stops at a single tent, nor does the tension end with one son. Because while Ishmael grew wild under the desert sun, another child was stirring in Rebekah's womb. 2 nations were already wrestling not in battlefields, but within a mother's body. Jacob and Esau, heirs to Isaac, brothers by blood, enemies by destiny. And what unfolded between them would split mountains, kingdoms, and eventually the map we know today. So if you've ever wondered why Edom and Israel clashed, why the rage of ancient brotherhood still flickers in modern borders, stay close. Because their beginning wasn't just a birth, it was a prophecy. And what God said to Rebekah still shapes the world beneath your feet. If this journey has opened your eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next revelation. Like this video if it stirred something deep, and share it with someone who's asking the same questions you once did. Let's walk this ancient path together. She felt it before she saw it. The twisting, the turning, the violence within her. Rebekah clutched her womb and cried out to heaven. If this is from God, why is it like this? Because even before they were born, the war had begun. 2 boys, 2 nations, 2 destinies locked in conflict before they ever drew breath. And then came the voice. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Not advice, not prediction. Prophecy. Esau came first, red wild, wrapped in hair like a hunter's cloak. Then Jacob, grasping his brother's heel as if even in birth he refused to be left behind. And from that moment, the struggle never stopped. Esau hunted, Jacob plotted. Esau wore the smell of the field. Jacob smelled of tents and schemes. Their father loved the elder. Their mother chose the younger. Favoritism fractured the family, and longing turned to rivalry. But the true fracture came over a bull. It was simple. Esau came in hungry. Jacob was cooking. "Give me some of that stew," Esau said. And Jacob, ever the opportunist, replied, "Sell me your birthright." And Esau, tired, impulsive, dismissive, agreed. In a single moment, the inheritance passed from flesh to faith, from the son of strength to the son of strategy. But Jacob wasn't done. Later, with his mother's help, he disguised himself, put on goat skins, and stole the blessing of the firstborn. Isaac, old and blind, placed his trembling hands on the wrong son's head. Or was it the right one? Because heaven had said the older would serve the younger. And yet the fallout was immediate. Esau wept. He raged. He vowed vengeance. The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. So Jacob fled into the desert, into exile, into destiny. And as he slept on stones, a ladder appeared. Not one he climbed, but one heaven lowered. Angels ascending and descending. And above it all, God spoke. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. So despite the deception, despite the trickery, the promise remained. Jacob had carried it, not because he earned it, but because God had spoken. Years passed. Jacob became Israel. Esau became Edom. And the two lines diverged. Israel, the chosen, the covenant keepers, a nation born in struggle and sustained by grace. Edom, the proud, the bitter, a nation built in the shadows of what was lost. And from that point forward, every time Israel rose, Edom remembered. Every temple stone was a reminder. Every prophet's voice reopened the wound. And so Edom stood by when Jerusalem fell. They mocked when Babylon breached the walls. They cheered as their brother bled. And God saw it all. The prophet Obadiah, the shortest book in the Old Testament, holds one of the most thunderous indictments. You stood aloof on the day that strangers carried off his wealth. You were like one of them. God didn't forget. Because this was more than politics, more than geography. It was family. And betrayal in a family cuts deeper than any sword. The pain between Israel and Edom wasn't just national, it was ancestral. It was the ache of promises divided. But here's the revelation. God didn't hate Esau. He honored him with land. He gave him kings before Israel had any. He allowed Edom to flourish. But Edom couldn't let go of the blessing, of the birthright, of the bruise. And so they positioned themselves generation after generation, not as brothers, but as enemies. And the seeds of Esau's rage grew into resistance, rebellion, revenge. Centuries later, when Jesus was born, a king named Herod ruled. He was an Edomite. And when he heard of a newborn king of the Jews, what did he do? He ordered the slaughter of infants. The old war continued. From womb to war, from heel to sword, from bitterness to bloodshed. But God still sees both lines. He still remembers the prophecy, the ache, the story. And while Israel holds the covenant, Edom holds a lesson. That rage never healed becomes rebellion. That rejection unredeemed becomes resistance. But redemption is possible, even for Edom. Because prophecy doesn't just declare conflict, it also promises resolution. One day the mountains of Esau will bow. One day the brothers will meet again, not in hatred, but in healing. If this spoke to something in your spirit, if you felt the ancient ache between brothers still echo in the modern world, then stay with us. Because the story doesn't end here. Next we return to the sons of Jacob, to Joseph, to betrayal in a different form, and how God can take what was meant for evil and use it to save nations. Like what you're hearing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more timeless insights. Click like if this story gave you a new lens on old headlines. And share with someone who's still trying to understand the roots of today's rage. What comes next will take us into Egypt, into slavery, and into the heart of divine reversal. Shall we continue? But sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from nations. They come from brothers. And this time it wasn't Edom who turned against Israel. It was Israel against itself. Because from the 12 sons of Jacob, a pattern returned. Favoritism, envy, betrayal. And at the center of it all, Joseph. He was only 17. Bright-eyed, naive, a dreamer. He spoke of stars bowing, of sheaves kneeling, of greatness, not earned, but given. And his brothers hated him for it. They hated his coat. They hated his dreams. They hated that he was loved more than them. So they conspired. They didn't kill him, not directly. They threw him into a pit, then sold him for silver, and watched as a caravan carried him away, his cries fading behind the camels. They dipped his robe in goat's blood and lied. He was devoured, they told Jacob. He's gone. But heaven knew the truth. And the God who once watched Cain slay Abel now watched 11 brothers bury their guilt in silence. Meanwhile, Joseph arrived in Egypt, not as a prince, but as a slave. He served in Potiphar's house, rose in favor, fell in scandal, thrown in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And still the Lord was with him, because divine favor doesn't disappear in dungeons. It deepens. Joseph interpreted dreams behind bars, spoke hope in chains, and in time was remembered. Pharaoh summoned him not for his lineage, but for his gift. And in a single day, Joseph rose from the prison to the palace. The boy in the pit became the ruler of a nation. Only God writes stories like that. And then came the famine. It stretched across borders. Withered crops, emptied granaries. And Jacob's sons, those same brothers, came to Egypt looking for food. They didn't recognize Joseph, but he recognized them. The ones who sold him, who broke their father's heart, who stripped him of his name. Now they bowed before him, just as he once dreamed. But Joseph didn't gloat. He wept. Because the dream wasn't about domination. It was about deliverance. He could have crushed them. Instead, he tested them, watched for change, waited for truth. And when Judah stepped forward, offering himself in place of Benjamin, Joseph saw it. Repentance. And in one of the most sacred scenes in Scripture, Joseph revealed himself. "I am Joseph," he said. "Is my father still alive?" The brothers froze. Fear surged. But Joseph leaned in. "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." This is the reversal that echoes through every generation, that even betrayal can become a bridge. Even slavery can set up salvation. Joseph wasn't just a son. He was a shadow, a pattern, a prophetic picture. Sold for silver, falsely accused, raised to rule, and in the end, forgave. Does that remind you of anyone? Because before Jesus was ever born, Joseph lived the gospel. Not in Bethlehem, but in Pharaoh's courts. Not with 12 disciples, but 12 betrayers, and he saved them all. Why does this matter? Because Egypt wasn't just a refuge. It became a crucible. And the sons of Jacob, the future tribes of Israel, multiplied in a foreign land. Prospered, then enslaved. The deliverance of Egypt started with betrayal, but it would end in a sea split by glory. And Joseph's bones, he made them promise to carry him out, to not leave him buried in Egypt. Because Joseph knew Egypt was never the end. The promise still stood. And when God moves, no pit prison or Pharaoh can stop him. Now that the 12 tribes are planted, now that Israel has grown under a pagan flag, we come to the man who will split seas and speak with God face to face. But before Moses rises, a different Pharaoh rises too. And he does not know Joseph. Which means the next part of this story won't begin in dreams. It will begin in chains. But Egypt forgets quickly. A new Pharaoh rose. He didn't remember Joseph, didn't remember the dreams, only saw numbers. And the children of Israel, once guests, had become a threat. They multiplied too fast, grew too strong. So Pharaoh made a decision: control them before they overtake us. He enslaved them, turned promise into labor, turned covenant into bricks, turned sons of Jacob into shadows of survival. But oppression cannot silence prophecy. It only amplifies it. So Pharaoh ordered the midwives. Kill the boys, let the girls live. Genocide dressed in strategy. Infanticide masked as national security. But 2 women, Shiphrah and Puah, feared God more than Pharaoh. They let the boys live. And among those boys, one floated down the Nile in a basket lined with pitch and hope. A Hebrew child hidden in reeds, watched by a sister found by a princess, and named Moses. He grew in Pharaoh's palace, raised as royalty, educated in Egypt's wisdom, but his blood burned with Hebrew fire. One day he saw a taskmaster beat a slave, and something inside him broke. He killed the Egyptian, buried the body, then fled. From palace to pasture, from crown to callous. And in the wilderness of Midian, Moses forgot the dreams. But God didn't. One day a bush burned, but wasn't consumed. Moses turned aside. And in that turning, the voice called his name. Moses. Moses. He stood barefoot on holy ground. And God said, I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry. I have come down to deliver. And then he sent Moses. But Moses hesitated. I can't speak. They won't believe me. Send someone else. And God, patient but firm, said, I will be with you. I made your mouth. I will give you signs. And thus began a confrontation not just between a man and a king, but between a kingdom and a covenant. Moses returned to Egypt, staff in hand, Aaron beside him. And he spoke to Pharaoh words that shook the heavens. Let my people go. Pharaoh laughed, and God responded. With blood, with frogs, with gnats, with darkness, with hail, with boils, with death. 10 plagues. Each one not just a punishment, but a strike against Egypt's gods. God wasn't just freeing Israel. He was dethroning idols. And then came the final blow, the death of the firstborn. Unless a lamb died instead. Its blood painted on doorposts, a sign, a shield. And that night the angel passed over. The wails of Egypt rose with the dawn. But in Goshen, Israel stood saved by blood poised for freedom. Pharaoh relented. Israel walked out. But Egypt's heart hardened once more. Chariots chased, soldiers thundered. And before Israel stood the Red Sea. No boats, no bridge, no way forward. And yet the cloud moved. The wind blew, the waters split. And Israel walked through walls of miracle. When the last sandal touched dry ground, the sea closed. Pharaoh's army drowned. And a song rose. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. From slavery to singing, from bondage to banner. But the wilderness wasn't rest. It was refinement. Because freedom is not the end. It's the beginning. Moses would go up Sinai. Israel would tremble at thunder, and God would write with fire. But before the laws, before the tablets, before the covenant was sealed, a golden calf waited. Because even rescued people can still rebel. The mountain trembled, fire fell, clouds wrapped Sinai like a shroud. And God descended, not with armies, not with vengeance, but with covenant. Moses climbed alone, 40 days, 40 nights. And up there God spoke. He gave not just rules, but relationship. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. 10 words, 10 windows into his heart, carved in stone, etched by fire. And below, they waited, then worried, then wandered. It started with silence, then whispers, then a suggestion. Where is this Moses? He's been gone too long. Maybe he's dead. And someone said, make us a god. Aaron, the brother, the priest, the voice. He gave in. Bring your gold, he said. Let's mold a future we can see. They melted earrings. They shaped a calf and called it God. The same people who saw the sea split now bowed to a statue. And they danced, not with joy but with amnesia. On the mountain, God saw it all. He burned with grief. He burned with anger. They have corrupted themselves, he told Moses. I will destroy them. Start again with you. But Moses interceded. He pleaded. He reminded God of his promise. He stood in the gap, and God relented. Moses descended, tablets in hand, face aflame. But what he saw shattered him. The music, the dancing, the idol. He threw the tablets, they broke. Because the covenant had already been broken. He ground the calf to powder, mixed it with water, made them drink it. Then he asked one question: who is on the Lord's side? And the Levites stepped forward. That day blood was spilled, not by God's command, but by the consequence of choice. Sin always demands something, but God wasn't done. The next day Moses climbed again, empty hands, heavy heart. And he prayed the boldest prayer in Scripture: blot me out if you won't forgive them. He offered himself, a substitute, a shadow of what would one day come. But God said no. Only one would one day take the full wrath and write mercy in blood. Still God called Moses again. He told him, cut 2 new tablets, I will write again. Because even when we break the covenant, God is willing to restore it. This time, God passed it. Not in thunder, not in flame, but in words. The Lord merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. And Moses bowed. The law was rewritten, the covenant renewed, and the people moved forward. But a generation that walked through seas still refused to walk in trust. They grumbled, they doubted. They looked back to Egypt more than ahead to Canaan. And so they wandered for 40 years. They ate manna, drank from rocks, saw serpents turn to salvation, clouds by day, fire by night. And still they died in the wilderness. Only 2 from that generation entered the promise. Because deliverance from Egypt doesn't always mean deliverance from unbelief. But before Moses died, he stood on a mountain again. Not Sinai, but Nebo. He saw the land, the promise, but he would not enter. God buried him, and no one knows where. But one day he would stand again, on a different mountain beside Jesus at the Transfiguration. Because God does not forget his faithful ones. And the people, they now stood at the threshold of destiny. A new leader rose, a warrior, a worshiper, a man who once lingered at the tent of meeting long after Moses had left. His name was Joshua, and before them stood the Jordan River. Behind them, wandering. Ahead of them, war, but also the promise. The Jordan stood still, not because it dried up, but because God told it to. As the priest stepped in, carrying the ark, the water piled back like a wall, and Israel crossed, not in haste, but in reverence. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed, a monument of memory, because God knew how quickly humans forget. Jericho was next, a city locked in fear, walls thick with pride, fortified with history. But God's strategy was silence. March. Don't speak, don't strike. Just walk. For 6 days they obeyed. On the 7th they marched 7 times, then they shouted, and the walls collapsed. Not by catapult, not by fire, but by faith. Because obedience is the loudest sound in heaven. Rahab was spared. A harlot turned heroine because she hid the spies, because she believed in a God she had only heard of. Faith doesn't need sight, it needs surrender. And her scarlet cord became a sign not just of survival but of redemption. Her name would one day appear in the lineage of the Messiah. But success is a dangerous wine. After Jericho, Israel grew bold. Too bold. They eyed Ai, a smaller city. We don't need everyone, they said. So they sent a few. But they lost, were chased, shamed. Why? Because someone had touched the devoted things. God had said, all in Jericho is mine. But Achan, he saw he wanted, he took. Gold, silver, a cloak, buried beneath his tent. Privates and public consequence. God told Joshua, there is sin in the camp. You cannot stand against your enemies until it's dealt with. So they searched, tribe by tribe, family by family, until Achan stood exposed. And with him his sin. He confessed, but it was too late. He and all he had were stoned and burned. Harsh, yes. But sin isn't a private matter in a covenant community. The promised land was holy ground. And holiness is not optional for those who carry his name. After cleansing came conquest. Ai fell. Then other cities. Kings united. But they were no match for the captain of heaven's armies. The sun even stood still, not for spectacle, but for strategy. So Israel could finish the battle. Because when God fights, creation bends. Joshua divided the land. Tribes received portions, borders were drawn. But not all enemies were removed. Some giants remained, some strongholds lingered. Because occupying promise takes more than arrival. It takes endurance. And as Joshua aged, he gathered the people. One last time, one last charge. Choose this day whom you will serve, he said. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He died full of years, but not before reminding them. This land is gift, but your faithfulness is the key to keeping it. They had the land, they had the law, but they forgot the Lord. After Joshua, there was no king, no single voice, no unifying call. And in the silence, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The book of Judges opens not with peace, but with a pattern. Sin, slavery, supplication, salvation. And then it repeats. They worshipped Baal. They built altars to Asherah. They mingled with Canaan not to convert, but to conform. And so God gave them over. To Moab, to Midian, to Philistia. Enemies rose. Harvests were stolen, cities oppressed. And then they remembered. They cried, they repented, and God, because he is mercy, raised up judges. Not courtroom judges, but deliverers, warriors, prophets. And each one a flawed vessel used in holy hands. Othniel, first of the judges, a nephew of Caleb. He brought peace. Ehud, left-handed, stabbed a king with surprise and strategy. Deborah, a prophetess, sat under a palm, called men to battle when they feared to go. And Jael, a woman with a tent peg, who crushed the enemy's head while he slept. God uses whom he wills. Then came Gideon, a farmer, a doubter, a man hiding in a winepress. But God called him mighty warrior. He tore down idols. He gathered an army. But God said, too many. So he whittled them down from 32,000 to 300. Armed with torches and trumpets, they broke jars and shouted, and Midian fled. Because when God fights, numbers don't matter. But Gideon faltered. He made an ephod, a garment of honor, and Israel turned it into an idol. Even victories can breed downfall if not guarded by humility. Then came Jephthah, a son of a prostitute, rejected then called back when war came. He vowed foolishly, if I win whatever greets me first, I'll offer as a sacrifice. He won, and his daughter came running. Tragedy born of zeal without wisdom. And then Samson, a man of strength but weak in soul, chosen before birth, Nazirite by vow, set apart. He killed lions, slayed Philistines, carried gates on his shoulders, but he loved the wrong women. Delilah cut more than his hair, she severed his covenant. Captured, blinded, mocked. But in prison his hair grew, and with one final prayer, he pulled down the temple and crushed his enemies, and himself. The era of Judges was dark, not because God disappeared, but because his people did. They had law, but lacked love. They had deliverance, but forgot devotion. The final verses sum it all. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's the tragedy, not chaos from outside, but collapse from within. Yet even in darkness, God sowed seeds. A story was rising not in the battlefield, but in the barley field. A foreign widow named Ruth, a redeemer named Boaz, and from them a lineage would bloom. A line that would one day bring a boy with a sling and a heart after God. But that is the story to come. The days were dim, but God was not done. Out of Moab came Ruth, a widow, a foreigner, but loyal to Naomi, her mother-in-law. "Your God shall be my God," she said. And heaven smiled. In Bethlehem's fields she gleaned, bent low, gathering scraps behind harvesters. But Boaz saw her, not just her poverty, but her purity. He was her kinsman redeemer, a relative with the right to restore. He covered her with his cloak. He bought the field. He married the girl. And Ruth, once an outsider, became the great-grandmother of a king. Because God's plans are never limited by bloodlines. Then came Samuel, born to Hannah, a barren woman who prayed with tears too deep for words. She promised, "If you give me a son, I'll give him back." God answered, and the boy grew up in the temple, hearing God when others didn't. But Israel cried out, "We want a king, not God. A man, like the nations." And God grieved, but permitting said yes. Enter Saul, tall, impressive, chosen, anointed by Samuel. But quickly he unraveled. He feared the people more than God. He sacrificed without waiting. He disobeyed clear commands. And the Lord said, "I regret making Saul king, because outward strength means nothing when the heart rebels." Then came David, the youngest son, overlooked. While his brothers stood before Samuel, he was in the fields tending sheep. But God whispered, "Man looks at the outward appearance. I look at the heart." And David's heart was his, anointed with oil, but still a shepherd. He waited, he served, he played music for Saul to calm his torment. But destiny stirred. The Philistines came. A giant taunted Israel, Goliath, mocking armies and God alike. No soldier dared step forward. But David, he asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God?" With a sling and 5 smooth stones he ran toward the giant, not away. And 1 stone found its mark. Goliath fell, the earth shook, and Israel roared. Because God does not save by sword or spear. He saves by faith. David became a hero. Songs were sung. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. And Saul grew jealous. Rage brewed, spears were thrown, pursuits began. David fled not as a coward, but as a man of honor. He would not touch God's anointed. Even when Saul slept unguarded, David cut a corner of his robe, but not his life, because mercy was his weapon. In caves he wrote psalms. In exile he built faith. In rejection he was refined, until Saul fell, not by David's hand, but by his own wounds on the battlefield. And David wept, for Saul, for Jonathan, for the fallen, because greatness does not gloat when enemies perish. Then David became king, first of Judah, then all Israel. He conquered Jerusalem. He brought the ark. He danced before the Lord unashamed. And God said, "This is a man after my own heart." But David was not perfect. In peace he stumbled. He saw Bathsheba. He took her. He killed her husband. And the prophet Nathan confronted him. "You are the man." Conviction pierced. David repented. And though forgiven, the sword never left his house. Because sin always sows what it will later reap. Yet even in failure, David worshipped. He wrote psalms from the depths of sorrow and the heights of joy. He knew God not just in victory, but in valleys. "The Lord is my shepherd." He didn't just sing it, he lived it. His throne stood, his name endured. And from his line would one day come another king. But not yet. David grew old. He longed to build a temple, a house for the Lord. But God said, "You shed much blood. Your son will build it." So he prepared. He gathered gold cedar stone. And to Solomon, his son, he said, "Be strong and courageous. Keep the Lord's commands. He will not forsake you." Solomon rose, young, uncertain, but he asked not for power nor riches. He asked for wisdom. and God gave it, more than any man before or since. He built the temple, magnificent, glorious, gold-lined walls, cherubim carved high, a house for heaven's name on earth. And the Lord came, a cloud filled the courts. Priests couldn't stand to minister. God had a home among men. Solomon's kingdom flourished. Peace, trade, wonders. The Queen of Sheba traveled far and left in awe. Silver was common, cedars plentiful, songs flowed. And yet his heart drifted. He loved many women, and with them their gods. High places were built, altars to Molech, worship to Ashtoreth. And God was grieved. He warned, "If you turn, the kingdom will split." Solomon didn't listen, so the word was sealed. And after his death, it broke. Rehoboam, his son, ignored wise counsel. He ruled with harshness, and 10 tribes rebelled. Israel split, north and south, Israel and Judah. 2 nations, 2 kings, 2 paths. In the north, no good king arose. Idols stood tall. Baal was worshipped. Prophets were hunted. And Elijah came, fire from heaven. A contest on Mount Carmel. Choose this day. If Baal is God, serve him. If the Lord, serve him. The fire fell. The people bowed. But Jezebel raged, and Elijah fled. Still God wasn't done. He whispered in the cave, not in wind or quake or fire, but a still small voice. And Elijah heard. In Judah there were moments. Hezekiah restored worship. Josiah found the book of the law. Revival sparked, but it never lasted. Sin returned. Justice was ignored. The poor were crushed. Prophets were mocked. And God warned, through Isaiah, through Jeremiah, through countless voices, if you do not return, judgment will come. But they didn't listen. So Babylon came. Jerusalem burned. The temple fell. The ark vanished. Kings were chained. Children marched into exile. And the people wept. By the rivers of Babylon they hung their harps. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But even in exile God spoke. I know the plans I have for you, he said through Jeremiah. Plans to give you a future and a hope. Through Daniel visions came. Beasts, kingdoms, the Ancient of Days. A son of man riding on clouds. And Daniel understood. This exile was not the end. 70 years passed. Then Cyrus came. A Persian king, not of Israel, not of covenant, but called my anointed. He issued a decree, go, rebuild the house of the Lord. And so they did. Zerubbabel led the first wave. Ezra restored the law. Nehemiah rebuilt the wall. The temple stood again, smaller, humbler. No ark, no cloud, but God's promise still alive. And prophets said, behold, your king is coming, not in chariots, but lowly riding on a donkey. The Old Testament closed, not with fanfare, but with waiting. Malachi spoke last. The Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings. And then silence. 400 years. No prophets, no vision. But heaven was not still. A voice would cry in the wilderness. A manger would cradle a king. A cross would bear redemption. But that belongs to the new covenant. Thank you for journeying with us through covenants and kings, through exile and hope. If this story stirred your soul or opened your eyes, please like this video to let YouTube know it mattered. Subscribe to stay with us for the next stories yet to unfold. Share it with someone searching for meaning in chaos. May peace anchor your heart, and may your lamp stay lit even in the midnight hour, because one day the King will return.